All right, well, I want to be respectful of people's time, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the first Culture and Contemporary Life virtual panel for 2025. I'm Rachel Rinaldo from the University of Colorado Boulder. This panel series is a project of the American Sociological Association's section on the sociology of culture. And I want to thank Michael Johnston, who's a co-organizer with me of the series this year. My co-organizer and moderator for this panel is Fawzia Hussain from Queen's University in Canada. And for this first panel, when we started talking about this series a few months ago and planning what we wanted to do, we really wanted to address the intersections of gender, religion, and nationalism. It's something that has certainly seemed pressing for the last number of years, but I think even more so since then, these issues, as we are in this era of resurgent religious nationalisms, backlash against feminism, these I think have become increasingly urgent and pressing issues for social scientists to address. So I'm really excited today for our guest speakers to contribute their insights and perspectives. Just a couple quick logistics about how this panel will work. Fawzia will introduce the speakers briefly and pose several discussion questions, and then each of the speakers will address those. And then at the end, we will open it up to audience questions. But as the panel is really only supposed to be about an hour long, we'll probably only be able to take a few of those questions. But certainly, please do post them in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those during the session. And with that, I will turn it over to Fawzia.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CCL panel. I'm going to begin by introducing our esteemed panelists before moving on to a discussion centered on 4 key questions that explore the intersections of gender, religion, and nationalism from a global perspective. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So we have with us today Dr. Nandini Deo, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Lehigh University. And her research focuses on gender, religion, and civil society, with a particular emphasis on India. She has authored numerous books and articles, including her recent publication, Post-Secular Feminisms, Religion and Gender in Transnational Context, which came out with Bloomsbury Press. We also have with us Dr. Saskia Schaefer, who leads a research group on religion and democracy in Indonesia and Turkey at the University of Berlin. Her team has recently examined the rise of anti-LGBT rhetoric in these regions during the 2010s and early 2020s, and she's currently working to establish a new research group in collaboration with civic education practitioners, focusing on the democratic potential of religion to address racism and anti-Semitism in Germany. And then, last but not least, we have Dr. Raewyn Connell, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney and a pioneering scholar in sociology with contributions spanning gender and masculinities, globalization, and critiques of the Northern bias in social theory. Her influential works, including Masculinities, which was published in 1995, and Southern Theory, which was published in 2007, have profoundly shaped our field, and really, she needs no introduction. So with these introductions, let's dive into our discussion. My first question, which I'm posing, and I'm going to ask Professor Deo to answer first, followed by Professor Schaefer, and finally Professor Connell. And the question is, with the rise of religious nationalist movements across the world, social scientists have turned attention to the relationship between religion and politics. But the question of gender has received less attention with regard to religious nationalisms. So what role does gender play in religious nationalist movements? And what empirical and theoretical issues should social scientists be investigating to better understand the intersections of gender, religion, and nationalism? Let's begin with Professor Deo.
Thank you, for letting me get the first word, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Uh, I have been trying to think about this question in terms of, I think one of the things that we know from the study of religious nationalism, but also just from the study of nationalism in colonial contexts, is that gender and sort of the woman question is often a way in which conversations about the nation and its definition get framed. So the work of various historians and so on has shown us the way in which debates over the rights of women, their roles in society, and so on, are actually often sort of stand-ins for these bigger questions about what is the nation and how is it to be defined, who belongs and who doesn't belong. But obviously, when you ask the questions in those ways, it's very abstract and is not so conducive to, I think, public debate. Whereas everybody can understand questions about, what is the role of a mother? This is, questions about like, what does sort of marriage mean? What are the kinds of ways in which we should govern that? So I think it continues to be the case that gender can often serve as a kind of, apolitical or seemingly apolitical, but very concrete language in which people can have debates that are actually about other things, not really about gender. Um, and so this is sort of an idea that I've been thinking about a fair bit and trying to think about it in different contexts, right? So why is there so much scapegoating of like gender and sexual minorities when they don't actually pose any kind of significant threat to anyone, right? And so one way to think about it is that they just become a vehicle to have these other conversations. In terms of the second part of the question of, things that we might not have paid as much attention to, but that I think we could, is really the role of emotions in religious nationalism. And if we think about the nation not just as a legal fiction, but in terms of, right, the way in which this is an imagined community that's also an emotional community and one that people have an emotional connection to, I think there again we can see the way in which there are these links between the nation, the family, and religion. So where religion also is activating emotions, but is sort of broadly universalistic, and the family is certainly a realm of emotion, but is very particularistic. The nation sort of stands in between them. But the nation and nationalism also tend to be very jealous so in terms of the kind of emotional attachment that they want from people. And so I think there is this kind of like pull within any kind of nationalist tradition towards the universalism that religion can offer, as well as the kind of particularism that the family can offer. And I think there's something over there. And I think some of our colleagues, again, in the humanities who have been thinking about like affect theory and so on, might be useful for us to sort of think about how we can use some of their theorizing to think more about this question.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Schaefer.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to remind ourselves just how gendered the concept of the nation itself is, from said role models to military service and citizenship laws and reproductive policies and these assigned roles in these nationalist narratives. I'd like to make 2 points on gender and one on religion. So first, religious nationalist movements consistently emphasize this nuclear heteronormative family as the foundation of society, right? I live in Germany and I work empirically on Indonesia and Turkey, and in all 3 cases, politicians increasingly defend and privilege this construct of the modern conservative family structure against what they perceive as threats from individualization or more fluid gender norms. And second, and connected to this, gender and sexuality have often become these key fault lines in nationalist exclusion. In Russia and Turkey and Indonesia in the last 2 decades, for example, political homophobia has been framed as a defense of national morality, and social conservatives position LGBTQI plus people as internal enemies, and they weave this construction as they as enemies into their nationalist conspiracy theories that have often existed for a long time, and now they weave this new internal enemy into them and portray queer rights as a Western plot to undermine national sovereignty. So I think we need to look at how this entanglement is happening there empirically. And this is not a local phenomenon. We see similar patterns in Poland and in Hungary, and as I said, in Turkey and Southeast Asia. So we see how these strategies, the rhetoric really circulates and travels. And then we could also talk about how the far right in Western Europe, on the other hand, portrays especially Muslim immigrants as particularly patriarchal. And so similar to the accusation of anti-Semitism towards Muslims, this allows Western European far-right actors to externalize sexism and anti-Semitism, and to portray themselves as queer-friendly and just towards women, and not actually address their own sexism. So either way, nationalism is always gendered, even if it's sometimes in kind of flipped around or different ways. And on religion, I've really found Sudipta Kaviraj's concept of thin religion particularly helpful in understanding how religious nationalism works. And so this concept of thin religion, so it differs from more encompassing practices of religiosity that include complex rituals and practices and beliefs. And instead, this thin religion combines elements of religion, politics, and nationalism, and glosses over complex doctrinal discussions and intra-national regional differences, etc. And so political leaders, be they Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, make eclectic use of these religious symbols and tropes, and use religion as a stand-in for ideology, rather than making substantive religious references. And so we've seen examples in like Modi in India and Christian nationalists in Hungary and the US. They've used this strategy to create these broad but shallow religious appeals. In Indonesia, Islam has been reduced to simplistic moral binaries of proper Islam and questions of in and out belonging, rather than legal or philosophical depth. And finally, I think we need to understand what makes these somewhat awkward alliances so appealing. Yeah, why do they work when actually they are so awkward in their very different universalist approaches?
Thank you so much, Professor Connell.
Sure. I think the first observation I'd make is that gender and gender relations have multiple roles in the new right-wing politics. So let me mention several. Firstly, and we've already seen this, gender gives important themes for new right rhetoric in a number of ways. As Saskia was saying, it becomes a way of drawing lines of inclusion and exclusion. And I think there's an interesting mechanism there that the new right works with a kind of new concept, which I would call gender crimes. In the United States, abortion has become such an idea. Sex change, trans existence seems to be becoming that in a number of cases. And on the other hand, of course, gender provides images of warmth and desirability, as we've seen with the family, notions of motherland and so forth. So it's important for right-wing rhetoric. Secondly, very curiously, the new right has become a new pathway for women advancing in politics. And we've seen that very recently in Europe with Le Pen and Meloni. I've heard it said that this is also happening in India, perhaps not in embodied politics, but in online politics. And I would be interested for people to know that situation better than I do, if that is indeed the case. So gender change is sometimes working in favour of right-wing mobilizations. And thirdly, gender offers new images and models, if you like, of supremacy, in particular, of course, male supremacy, patriarchy. So we're seeing something like a new style of masculinist politics in the United States with Trump, in Afghanistan with the somewhat chaotic authoritarianism there. A different kind of masculinist supremacy in China, and perhaps in India with the BJP. Again, I'm not so clued up on that. So there's a spectrum of effects, in other words, and that certainly gives sociologists a fair range of things to investigate. One of them I really think, even though this is one of my own specialties, of course, I think we're seeing very interesting things happen with masculinity in the new right. And it's not just a reassertion of anything like a traditional thing, the kind of thing that was attacked by the Me Too movement, the idea of toxic masculinity, but some new models of being and asserting one's status as a man seem to be emerging in it. And there is actually a history of masculinist reconstruction movements, goes back a couple of generations. This seems to me have, in some ways, to have very much the same flavour.
Thank you so much. The second question I'm going to ask, given the United States' outsized influence in global politics and the political history of our disciplines, political realities in the United States tend to dominate our understanding of the relationship between gender, religion, and politics. So what does the intersection of gender, religion, and politics look like from a more global perspective? And what should scholars in the global north be mindful of when analyzing global dynamics? And how can we better decenter the north to engage in more meaningful transnational analysis? I'm going to ask Dr. Saskia Schaefer to respond first, followed by Professor Raewyn Connell, and then finally Professor Dave.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an important and such a big question, right? My own academic background is in area studies, a discipline that, as we know, emerged out of colonial and post-colonial interests. And so this means that it has a lot of self-reflective work to do. So I think when thinking about how to decenter the global north, I find three angles particularly helpful. First, historicizing developments and viewing them in light of power relations. So this means paying attention to path dependencies and the genealogies of concepts, debates, and practices on the ground. So, for example, when I observe resistance to the idea of rights in some contexts, and I need to ask which histories inform this skepticism, and why might some people accept an attack on a queer event held in a hotel in Indonesia without situating these dynamics in their contexts. We, of course, risk imposing frameworks that don't resonate locally and that don't help us understand anything. And then second, recognizing positionality. This is something that we talk a lot about, but it's still remains essential. We all carry our own intellectual and cultural biases, and it's important to work through those and with those as we analyze our data. So in my case, given my upbringing, I have a hard time understanding the prioritization of the collective over the individual. So there's a limit in my ability to analyze certain observations. And so I think just keeping this in mind is important at every stage. And finally, I think that we must not let this global South and global North framework obscure class dynamics. Just because someone critiques the global North doesn't mean that they necessarily pursue an emancipatory agenda. Many elites in the global South have read more Samuel Huntington or Bernard Lewis than Ali Shariati or Fatima Mernissi. And if we want to take a truly or work towards a truly global perspective, I think that we need to see these transnational connections at every level that we look at, be it grassroots movements or elites or intellectual traditions. So it's not just about looking elsewhere and listening to voices in the global South, but also questioning how exactly we frame our analysis, what voices we take seriously and why, and what voices we amplify, and then how we account for historical structures and contemporary power relations.
Thank you so much, Professor Connell.
Right. Three suggestions about how we could decenter Northern perspectives. One is what I think of as the Southern theory strategy, which is just to read the intellectual work from the global South. For instance, there's a lovely essay, which some of you I'm sure will know, by Ashish Nandi, which has a title something like A Report on the Current State of Health of the Gods and Goddesses of India. It was written about a couple of decades ago. And it's a beautiful reflection on the sort of changing conception of religion and the misinterpretations that are embedded in current, often in current politics. So take account of the intellectuals and the debates that are happening outside the global North. Secondly, pay serious attention to what are called sometimes called in Latin America the local cosmovisiones, visions of the universe, if you like. I'm descended from the settler population in Australia. There was an indigenous population here for 60,000 years before the Anglophones arrived and conquered the country. In indigenous societies, as far as I understand the matter, there were no gods in the European sense, or creeds, but there was a way of living in the context of the world and the land with intimate connections with the world around, which is easily misinterpreted and was misinterpreted by people like Durkheim as a primitive form of religion, but in fact is extremely sophisticated. So that's the kind of lesson that we have to learn in Australia, and I think is useful more widely. And thirdly, of course, just pay attention to the diversity and depth of Southern Global South feminisms in the pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial worlds. So taking account of people, I mean, I have a kind of litany of names that I often mention in giving talks, ranging from Louisa Lawson through Cartini, Ian Jen, Huda Sharawi, Elias Saviotti, coming up to the present, Bina Agarwal, Teresita de Barbieri, first-class thinkers and writers who are not part of the normal, global North influenced curriculum or reading lists for gender studies, but who really repay attention. So there is that kind of detail work in our teaching, I think, that needs to be done.
Thank you so much. Professor Deo?
Thanks. So I think one of the times where I really could see the payoff to trying to think beyond the global north and beyond the US tradition was really in a project I worked on with Rena Verma Williams, where we spent quite a lot of time thinking about the way in which, when you take Hinduism as the model based on which you're telling a story about religious nationalism, everything looks different than when you use Abrahamic traditions, right? So our conception of what religion is itself tends to be very much sort of based on assumptions about religion being a particular type of thing that has to do with belief and practice and teleologies and shared practices and so on. But when we actually diversify, like which religions we're thinking about this through, suddenly the kind of symbolic resources that are available for constructing a nationalism become very different, right? Some of them just aren't there, and then others become sort of easier to tap into. So so I thought about that when I was reading this question. I think one of the other sort of key things, again, as somebody who works in does work on India, is really paying attention to kind of the transnational networks and diasporas as sort of key players in shaping what religious nationalism looks like. So again, this is moving us beyond kind of a binary of the global south and global north, because actually what Hindu nationalism looks like is being co-constructed by people who are located in the global north and people who are located in the global south, and they're in conversation with each other. And so one can think about it in terms of the flows of people around the world and the flows of ideas, money, and especially sort of now with sort of the virtual conversations that are also taking place. So I think that's again a place where if we look at all of these interconnections, then we're less likely, I think, to end up centering one model as being sort of the ideal typical model of religious nationalism, and then everything else is, somehow deviant from it.
Okay, thank you so much. For my third question, I'm going to ask Professor Connell to go first, and then Professor Dave to go second, and Professor Schaefer to go last. So my third question is, scholars like Judith Butler have recently emphasized the urgency of responding to the global backlash against hard-won feminist freedoms. How can social scientists contribute to this effort? What kind of inquiries should we pursue? And what theoretical or methodological tools do we currently have or still need to develop in order to engage in this work effectively?
Well, firstly, social scientists are researchers. So we should be producing relevant empirical knowledge. And to me, the most decisive form of that is what used to be called studying up, that is studying the powerful. So what the new nationalisms, how do they work? How do decisions get made? Who holds influence and power in it? What interests are active in these movements? That should be subject matter for serious and extensive sociological research. And in fact, I think we should, in a way, be creating a new field of research here. I would call it Trump studies. I envisage these Trump studies quarterly as an important new journal. And it's something I think that the current US government will not wish to censor. But we could add also billionaire studies and so on. Get on with the kind of critical social science of the new power holders and the new movements. There is some of this already, of course. but it can be expanded and developed. Secondly, sociologists are intellectuals. We argue, and one of the things we can do in this context is produce arguments about what's going on and what should go on. I think, for instance, in a lot of the right-wing stuff that's circulating at the moment, there is sheer bad theology. And I can't see any reason why we shouldn't be in critical mode and responding to that. There's also a lot of bad logic. There are circular arguments, self-aggrandizing arguments and so forth. And there are also ironic and dialectical things going on that we can talk about, such as the way that the claims and boundary drawing that's going on have the effect of the destruction of social trust. Brilliantly illustrated by what Elon Musk and company are up to in tearing apart the US government machinery at the moment. And finally, as intellectuals and researchers, we have the role of broadcasting our findings and ideas, not just in the university classroom, but beyond academia too. And in that context, this will be hard for many of us because we're not necessarily trained to do this or familiar with doing it. But if we speak about these kinds of things with clarity, with simplicity and with integrity, we'll do okay and we'll make a contribution.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Dev.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with what Raewyn has already said, and I think maybe I want to add that part of our work is also sort of the work of imagination, and that we're at a moment where the stories that are being told about how the world works and how people work are such dark stories and so negative. And of course, they have a self-fulfilling kind of logic to them. And I think part of what we can also do, besides obviously studying these movements themselves, is also to study all the other things that people do and to highlight the diversity of the ways in which we can actually choose to live and do choose to live and organize ourselves. And I think there's something about sort of the playfulness about being able to imagine a time that is not this current moment, that I think is actually very productive and very useful. And so I'm really trying to think about, like, how can we start imagining what will come after the destructiveness of this current moment? Because it's clear that some of the sort of institutions and norms that we have taken for granted our whole lives, right, are going to be demolished in the coming years. And while certainly some people must and will do the work of resisting in this moment, I think we also have to do some of the work of imagining what will come next, because I think, as Raewyn said, these people haven't really thought it through, right? They're not good thinkers. They haven't really thought about how, if X, then Y down the road leads to something else. And so I think it feels like there's an opportunity for us to offer sort of feminist visions of solidarity and care and, sort of just having less conformity in terms of trying to engage in kind of rearguard action to just protect what had already been gained, but to also kind of open up and think about what could be. So that's me at my most optimistic moments these days.
Thank you. Dr. Schaefer.
Yeah, thank you. I almost don't want to speak after this because this is what we should all get to in the end, the idea of what visions we could be creating for after the destruction, and also, yeah, taking this role of highlighting what else is out there and has been done. But I'll still go back to picking up the broadcasting point, because as much as I think that we need to understand and study what has been happening, and as I said earlier, why a lot of these religious nationalist alliances resonate, and even understanding why people vote against their own interests. I also think that we do need to go beyond the classroom more, and I think we talk about this a lot, and we've talked about filter bubbles and echo chambers and polarization for more than a decade, but we still find it very difficult. And at this point, I sometimes think maybe I should be reading my Chantal Mouffe again, and maybe even, I don't know, marketing manuals. I don't know. And really think about the formats and the style of going beyond our circles. And so while I think we have a lot of working to do there, and we know actually what works. We know that young people spend a lot of time on TikTok, and yet we find it very difficult to even think about squeezing our ideas into a 2-minute video. I think these are hard things to learn, but some of us will have to do this somehow. And I think maybe in a more micro-oriented and immediate way, we need to further strengthen solidarity among people affected by anti-feminism, and support each other, and think very carefully about in what moments we should be challenging and criticizing each other, and in what moments it's important to amplify each other's voices and stand together to defend some of what generations before us have fought for. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. For the final question, I'm going to turn the conversation to the ongoing effort to decolonize social science. And I'd like to ask about the politics of this movement and its intersection with gender from a global South perspective. So, sorry. In particular, how has the language of decolonization been mobilized or co-opted by populist governments to advance specific cultural projects? And how should social scientists approach decolonial efforts with these complexities in mind? I'm going to ask Professor Dave to answer first, and then followed by Professor Schaefer, and finally Professor Connell.
Now, I'll be very brief because I think some of these ideas have already been put on the table, but I think about the work of people like Korean and Sundarajan and Puar, who've all sort of shown us ways in which the language of multiculturalism and of diversity in particular can get very easily co-opted in the global north, right? So I think that's the way in which things have gotten very messy, and it's easy for right-wing forces to kind of take advantage of that language. So there are some right-wing forces that sort of criticize those models, and then there are other right-wing forces that use those models to smuggle in their own forms of hegemony and domination, especially within immigrant communities. And then in the global South, like in the Indian case, right, there is this history of colonialism and missionary activity and political domination by an English-speaking elite and so on. And the Hindu right has very effectively been able to position itself as sort of speaking on behalf of the masses against this foreign and foreign aligned elite in ways that allow them to take on the mantle of being the true decolonizers. And so I think that like all of that language of decolonization is very susceptible to co-optation. And then I'm not sure how we sort of reclaim it or what to do about it, except, it is again to keep sort of discovering and talking about and amplifying, the indigenous traditions that have been internally, suppressed and attempted to be erased and so on. So I think we can do that. That helps us think better anyway. And then in terms of sort of what it means as scholars to decolonize, I think it's again the things that Saskia and Raewyn talked about in terms of we have to move beyond educational institutions, so beyond the classroom, beyond the university, beyond these sort of small islands of conversation, and to really think about, what are the like theories and the questions that people want to know and learn, right? So to sort of, I think, be more responsive to the learners who are before us, or the potential learners who could be before us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaefer.
Yeah, thank you. I think that this is an extremely urgent question that we really need to think about. This question of how to develop new repertoires and vocabulary as the far right everywhere really has been appropriating hitherto emancipatory vocabularies. And I see parallels to the way the far right has appropriated left discourses in Europe, right? There's this research for France, Didier Ribon, who's studied how formerly working class neighborhoods who voted for the left now all vote for the right. And this has happened in Germany too. And I see parallels there. And I think that if we connect this back to what we said earlier, that as social sciences, we develop arguments, but we also have to broadcast them, then I think we need to be very aware of how the far right appropriates emancipatory discourses and how we can develop new vocabularies. And yes, I think at this point, emphasizing indigenous traditions is something that people in Indonesia have been doing, and that has been working quite well. We somehow have to brace ourselves for the possibility of those two being reappropriated in the way they were appropriated in the early days of the young nation. So I think being really mindful of what we use there is what we need to do here. Theoretically, I've been finding the thoughts of the radical democracy theorists interesting, because the liberal democracy repertoire has lost a lot of its appeal, and so they discuss about how democracy encompasses not only the outcomes, but also the actual rules and procedures, and also who participates. So thinking of undocumented migrants as part of the collectives that shape our democracies. And so at the same time, always paying attention to the emancipatory goals of such a democracy rhetoric, because democracy itself has been reappropriated in its discourse. But yeah, so I think it's analytically expanding the notion of democracy and maybe leaving the focus on rights behind us, and then being just very careful and paying attention to how exactly the appropriations function.
Thank you so much, Professor Connell.
Yes, I think we're very much in agreement that there's intellectual work to be done to analyze the pretense of anti-colonialism that is currently being deployed. I hope I won't offend any Catholics present, but I think a very clear example of that is the stance that is currently being taken by the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, which has declared itself, in effect, the anti-colonial defender of global South cultures against the imperialist intrusion of gender ideology. Basically a hypocritical position for the organization, which is, after all, the greatest missionary organization in global history, now in effect playing the victim on precisely gender issues. So there's intellectual work to be done there. Another kind of intellectual work to be done is to study and publicize other models of anti-colonialism, better models of anti-colonial stances, as I think Saskia was implying. I would add to the case of Indonesia here, the example, for instance, of the developments in Rojava in northern Syria, with the creation of a highly participatory, democratic, and gender equal model of resistance. It won't take the same shape as, you know, the anti-colonialism of 2 generations ago. We have to be aware of that. But there are new possibilities emerging in different parts of the world that we can publicize. We can do something to circulate and publicize. And finally, I think we can practice a certain kind of decolonization in our own professional work. Especially those of us who live and work in privileged countries, have the possibility of forming connections with intellectual workers across the global south, of constructing joint projects, of transferring some resources and transferring a lot of recognition too. This is possible at a practical level. It's hard work, it takes time, but it can happen. And people who haven't any experience of this kind of work, a reasonable starting point actually is the International Sociological Association, going to events, connecting up with discussions in the various research committees of ISA, is a very good way of stepping into a more multilateral international discussion than we're usually part of. So lots of things that can be done. We all have limited resources, of course, and can't get weighed down by guilt over the things we're not doing. But the more of us are involved in this, the more these things will become practicable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to now ask Rachel Ronaldo to lead us through the rest of our program for today.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all the speakers for those really insightful comments. I think this panel has really highlighted for me so many different things, but particularly the multiple and very complicated ways that gender is intertwined with the rise of the new far right, if we want to call it that, and religious nationalisms in various parts of the world. And just, you know, among some of the things that came up, for example, were that the way that ideas about gender and practices of gender are used to define and draw boundaries around political communities and who's in and who's out. How they're used to mobilize particular groups, including sometimes women as well, who do play a role in many of these movements, and to whom these movements often appeal, I think, in ways that are sometimes hard for those of us who have more feminist commitments to admit. The elaboration of new forms of masculinity and what the implications of that are, as well as the appeal, I think, you know, something that's been written about quite a bit recently, right? The appeal to young men in particular of many of these new religious nationalist movements. But also, I think I'm inspired too by hearing Professor Connell's comments at the end here about, you know, thinking about there are kind of emancipatory possibilities, right, that are emerging all the time, and what can we learn from those as well. And certainly, I think as well, I think there is so much, and I think part of the reason Fauzia and I selected these very speakers is that we have so much to learn from, especially those of us in the US, from the experience of other countries, right, where these kinds of movements have been powerful for a while now, and places like India and Turkey and Indonesia and beyond. And I think there is actually already a lot of wonderful analysis and critique of the dynamics in those countries that we would be wise to pay attention to. So I think at this point, I will open it up. We have some time for questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, put it in the chat. And if we don't see any questions as well, I can give the speakers perhaps some time to respond to each other's comments.
Can I just throw in a follow-up question on the alternatives that we could be highlighting to end on the, you know, not on the destructive note, but to go back into what else there is. So in Indonesia, I see a lot of activists using the local and using indigenous vocabulary and concepts, and sometimes I worry that they will be picked up and appropriated, but at the same time, I see that activists on the ground are often quicker than academics. They publish more quickly and they adapt more quickly, and they often also understand what the other side is doing. So there's often a lot happening. I find what other vocabularies are there empirically that you've seen in India or elsewhere? Yeah, I think we've had the indigenous example. Then there's the Rojava case, which is very, very interesting because they've really combined the radical democracy theory in a very intellectual way with their procedures and their councils on the ground in a very sophisticated way. At the same time, of course, they're under heavy attack as we're speaking. Yeah, what else are there? What other repertoires do we see?
Professor Deo or Connell, do you want to respond to that?
Or we could collect. There is a question in the chat too.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I've been looking at, and in some ways, I think of it as a departure from this field of gender and religion. But one of the reasons I've sort of moved to this is actually looking at like the politics of educational experiments. And, you know, I think this is a really, really challenging moment for activists in India because there is so much censorship and fear, and this is also true for academics. And there are lots of things that people really just don't feel like they can say, and you know, so many of them have been arrested. There are the tax authorities are used as a way of threatening people and their institutions and their organizations. So, so in some ways, there's not very much being said in that sense. There are all kinds of discussions and solidarities, I think, being built around identities that are indigenous identities, caste-based identities, and that kind of thing. That is still continuing. But yeah, the other place where I'm seeing some sort of experiments with forms of radical democracy is in these educational experiments, right? Where sort of self-directed education is guiding people. So I don't know, those. It's fun to be around children and hopeful people. So that's where I've been spending my time.
Shall I add a little bit to that? We haven't had much about Latin America in the discussion yet, and I'd just like to note that there's a lot of activity in this area around Latin America too, and very interesting things. I mean, what's known in global North academia, I think, is mainly the decolonial movement, which is present in academia, and tends to highlight indigenous pre-colonial communities as a source of alternatives. But there are other things going on around Latin America too, which are worth knowing about. Peace movements and reconstruction movements in the wake of dictatorships and civil wars. Really interesting and have very strong feminist and gay presence. I know very, very interesting work of that kind being done, very creative work being done in Colombia, for instance, after the terrible and long civil war there. The travesti, for instance, when we're thinking about trans issues, travesti in Latin America, well recognized, highly marginalized group of people, also a source of very interesting new thinking. Travesti theory is now a recognized thing in this domain, which I haven't seen in the same way in other parts of the world. And looking also at women's movements in Afro-descendant communities, which deal in a different way from what academics are, who of course have strongly influenced by European cultures, are accustomed to understand and deal with gender issues. So different forms of feminism exist in those contexts, which are highly relevant to thinking about the forms of right-wing politics and nationalism, where that has been resurgent. So yeah, just adding a little bit of more to our resources that are worth being aware of.
Thanks. There is a question in the chat from Lynn Spillman for Professor Deo. I was intrigued by your reference to insights offered by seeing religious nationalisms through non-Abrahamic traditions. Would you say a bit more?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think part of what we were seeing, right, is that, and our students often do this, right? They assume that, well, religion is a particularly contentious, like sense of identity. It's something that if you highlight religion, you're very quickly going to get into situations of conflict. And that's sort of based on an idea of religion where certain assumptions are being made that religion has to do with shared beliefs, and that often it also sort of has a resource mobilization element to it, right? That people who belong to the same religious tradition meet in congregations, and because they have those bonds and sort of spaces, they're able to mobilize politically quite easily. But then if you think about it sort of in terms of Hinduism, right? First off, trying to nail down what the shared beliefs are I think it's impossible. Everybody has their own story, and some of the construction of sort of the thin religion that Dr. Connell referred to, it is very difficult to do, or you end up with something that's so thin that really all that everyone can agree to is that they're a Hindu. But who are you praying to? When do you pray to them? Where do you pray to them? How do you pray to them? Do you even pray, right? Like these things all become sort of open, because you don't necessarily have to have there isn't a shared creed of any kind, and there isn't the same kind of congregationalist structure to worship at all. So people do most of their rituals at home, and then there are sites that they go to and they might be connected to them, but it's not the same people at the same time every week and that kind of thing. So when you sort of open it up in that way, I think people start to see that, yeah, actually it would take work, right, to convince someone that your identity as a Hindu would easily translate into something that a political entrepreneur could come and mobilize around to achieve political goals, right? It's not necessarily the case that you could easily get people to do anything. And then once I think people can see that, then you can say, well, okay, so then what's the work that they have to do within evangelical communities or within, different Muslim communities? It's not the case that just because people have some kind of identification with a religion that they would also agree on what their politics are going to be, right? That sort of that translation of identity into a political position or into political action, I think we become more attuned to and pay more attention to the work involved in that, the sort of the productive mechanisms that lead from one to the other when we think beyond the Abrahamic traditions.
Thanks. I think if our speakers are able to stay on for just another couple minutes, we have one further question in the chat. How do you think the rise of non-religious spiritualism aligns with gender, feminism, and nationalism? Would anyone be interested in speaking to that question?
I'll make a start if I may. I recently interviewed an Indonesian activist concerning her work. She comes out of a peace initiative in central Sulawesi and works on collective decision making with her community. And I asked her about kind of I used my terms, democracy, decision making, religion. And after a while, she was quite hesitant to pick up the terms. And after we talked for a while, she said, I don't feel comfortable with the term democracy because that's a term that the Indonesian government has used in ways that I disagree with. And I'm actually not that comfortable with religion because a lot of the religious leaders have been complicit in practices that I disagree with. So we try to welcome people from different religions, but we try to stay away from religions as institutions. And she didn't say it so explicitly, and I don't want to put words into her mouth, but when I read the question, I think that she might be seeing, a feminist potential, though those are not the words she would be using, in going beyond the religious structures that we know. And this is kind of counterintuitive to people who came from the West to Indonesia and saw a lot of emancipation within Islamic structures compared to religious structures in Western countries. But it is there, and she described it for her own community. So yeah, I don't know if it's really spiritualism, and it probably doesn't fully address the question. But I just thought it was interesting that that she tries to not counter, but go beyond religious communities and boundaries.
Yes, I guess I might add a thought about the ambiguity or potential for different kinds of politics, both in non-doctrinal spirituality. I'm aware, for instance, of that having played a part in some masculinist revival movements. For instance, in the United States around 1990, when there was a cult of restoring masculinity by going into the woods and pretending to be bears and so forth. But the more serious side of that had some of this Jungian kind of spirituality around it. And much of that in gender terms was very reactionary, I would have to say. On the other hand, a tightly defined doctrinal religion such as Catholic Christianity has given rise to highly strongly democratic movements. I mean, remember liberation theology, which had a grip in the hierarchy itself and took right-wing forces in that church a whole generation to try and push out of the church. resulting in the kind of social conservatism that's dominant in Catholic Christianity at the moment. But every religion, and even sort of non-religious religion, has multiple possibilities within it, I guess is what I'm saying. It can't necessarily be pinned down to particular political use.
All right, well, thank you. We are a little beyond an hour, so I think we'll wrap it up here. But I'm very grateful to all our speakers for this very stimulating conversation, and thanks for everybody who joined.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.